Protecting apple trees and nut trees from deer. That's this episode of Death by Bunjie. Well, behind me you can see all my little orchard. This is the first little orchard, so to speak, that I ever planted. There's a dozen fruit trees here, 2 of which are apricots or apricots, depending on how you pronounce it. But the rest are all apple trees. They are apple trees that I really have spent a lot of time on. We spend a lot of work on these sorts of trees. As you know, if you have fruit trees, they do take a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. One of the things I don't like doing about apple trees is every year I've got to worry about these baskets and keep working on the wire cages that I have around these trees, keep adjusting them and doing all this additional work. This year in particular, I was especially worried about it because some of my trees had actually outgrown their baskets to the point of having it affect the growth of the tree. Now, it's one thing for your branches to sort of start protruding through these openings and the deer nibble the branches off. That's no good because you're not protecting the tree from the deer, and that's the whole point of having the cage on there in the first place. In addition to that, I noticed over here on that little orchard, the one behind the camera, there's a little orchard up from the well pad. Some of the trees in that little orchard were starting to have the growth of their branches affected by those cages. The cages were sort of acting as a chimney and directing all the growth of the branches up. The tree was sensing that the cage was there and it was trying to grow even though the cage was there, stopping the growth. I want those branches to go out a nice 45-degree angle, and the cages were starting to compress the tree. That's no good. So this year, Genevieve and I, we finally bit the bullet. We went around and we put giant cages around every tree, and I'm going to talk to you about that process in this video. Over the years, I've used a variety of different materials to make cages and to protect trees from deer. What I recommend based on what I've gone through here, don't use deer mesh unless you're going to make a fence. Don't use chicken wire, again, unless you're going to make a fence. Best thing that I have come across for protecting trees from deer is 2-inch by 4-inch welded wire, 14 gauge welded wire. This stuff seems to hold its form very well. It's easy to work with a sharp pair of wire snips. You can go through there and cut this stuff, and it's easy to work with, and it stays in place once you make a big basket with a couple of stakes, maybe 3-4 stakes at the most. It stays in place and holds its form very nicely. Meshes, chicken wire, deer can get their antlers caught in that stuff. Stay away from that, and instead try and use this type of welded wire. I buy it from Lowe's, 50-foot roll, 5 feet high, 2x4 metal welded wire fencing, 14 gauge. That stuff runs about $50 for a 50-foot roll. It's pretty pricey. But I will tell you this, save yourself in the long run the money and buy the stuff now and build the cages now at a size that's big enough, because down the road you're just going to be disappointed. You're going to spend a lot of time. If you're like me, you end up spending so much time working on adjusting the cages and making new cages that it sucks the fun right out of working on the trees, to the point where I almost wished I hadn't ever planted the trees. Now I'm very happy with it though, because these things, once you've got them in place, now these are protected with the deer. They're very easy to open up, just a couple of zip ties. I go through, cut those off. I can get right in and mulch. I can get right in there and prune, put them back together, zip tie them back in place, and you're good to go. On that note, I use orange zip ties. Those seem to work really, really well. They're very easy to see when I'm going through here with the lawnmower. When I go through here and clean the place up, I can see where those zip ties are when I'm looking for the zip ties so that I want to open it up. I know right where to go with the snips and right where to open up the cage. So it's very easy to use those zip ties, and the zip ties tend to hold this in place so well that I don't have to worry about it. I don't need any wire or any other method of holding the cage to the stakes. Now, how long do you want to cut the wire? How long do you want the fencing cut in order to make the cages? 2 25-foot lengths out of a 50-foot roll of this fencing makes a perfect 8-foot or so basket, 8-foot or so cage to go around your trees. You can't beat that. That's the easiest way to do it. If you buy a 100-foot long roll, then you're going to want to cut that into fourths. And basically every 25 feet is going to make an approximately 8 foot across basket. You can't beat that. It's nice and easy. You can get more complicated than that. Remember when we were in school and you learned pi, 3.14 times the length of it will tell you how big a round, you can do the math and figure that out. If you are interested in making other size cages, I did the math for you and I'll have those figures right in the description of this video. I'll put them right in there so you don't have to do that math. I saved you the trouble. I'm not going to go through that in this video. But if you have smaller plants, oak trees tend to grow up real fast. You don't need an 8-foot basket around an oak tree. You definitely do on a semi-standard or standard root or the smaller root apple trees, because those are going to grow out. They expand out very quickly. On the oak trees and some other plants, you don't need anything that's necessarily that big around. So I did the math, and for other types of plants, you're going to want those smaller baskets, and the math is in the description. I will be clear though, with apple trees, I really recommend, even on a small tree like the little Golden Delicious over behind me that we just planted this year because one of them died last year. I lost a tree. We replaced it this spring with a little tiny Golden Delicious, and that little tiny tree is inside a giant 8-foot cage just like this one. And the reason for that is that way I don't have to worry about that tree being affected by the smaller cage. I don't have to worry about having to make the cage bigger next year. I can just go in there and mulch, go in there and prune, go in and put the wrapper on, take the wrapper off, and do that without all that extra worry. It's really easy to get overwhelmed doing this stuff. Start small. If you haven't planted any fruit trees yet, I recommend that you don't go out and buy 28 fruit trees in 3 years and plant them all and then try and catch up and learn how to prune, learn how to fertilize, learn how to do all that stuff in the baskets and everything else. That's what I did. I don't recommend that you do that. I really do recommend that you do a little research on the trees, figure out what time of year you want your fruit to drop, get one species of tree, and then get another different species that complements it, that cross-pollinates well with it, and then just buy one 50-foot roll of welded wire 14-gauge fencing, cut it in half, and put one big cage around one of those trees and one big cage around the other tree, and you'll be very happy. You'll be able to get right in there and do it. When you've got a whole bunch of trees, if you're planting a whole bunch of trees, it's a whole bunch of work. And it's very stressful. In fact, I got to the point where I almost wished I'd never planted any of these trees, and I regret thinking that. If I'd have just gone to these giant baskets right off the bat, yeah, there's an expense, but it's an expense that over the long run, if you absorb that expense now, and if you do it slowly, you won't have the expense all at once. But by spending this money now this year, getting this stuff done, I have saved myself so many headaches. I was also able to keep using all of the existing cages. I just cut them open and then opened them up and then doubled them up in some places and pieced them together. And I've got giant cages around all 28 of the trees that I have on this property. What kind of stakes do we use to hold this welded wire in place? Now, like I said, it holds its form really well. It's good, sturdy wire. I use wooden stakes. I also got some from Lowe's that are already pre-sharpened. They drive right into this fresh ground real easy. Although if you spend a day driving them in there with a sledgehammer with one hand to drive those in the ground, you'll feel it at the end of the day. But nevertheless, it goes in the ground real easy. And they, with a couple of zip ties, hold the cages perfectly in place. I haven't had any trouble with it. So I recommend you look into those. If you're in an area with very aggressive deer, high deer densities, you might want to actually go out there and get the metal T stakes and drive those in the ground. Those will last forever. The wooden ones do rot off every year, so every year I got to drive them down a little deeper and that sort of thing. They don't last forever, but nevertheless, they're pretty cheap, and overall the cost isn't all that bad, so I use the wooden ones. One of our subscribers on YouTube asked me, how long do you leave these wire cages in place? And that's a great question. I'm going to leave these wire cages on these trees until the trees outgrow the cages. These cages are about 8 feet across, and therefore they're about 4 feet from the trunk. Once the branches start hitting the cages, once we get to the point where these cages are no longer protecting the branches from the deer, I suspect at that time I'll be able to take these cages off and use them somewhere else on different trees. That's great news. I think at that point, the tree will be able to survive on its own. Yeah, there's going to be some low-hanging fruit, there's going to be some low-hanging branches that the deer will nibble on, but the rest of them, there's going to be so much tree up in the air that it will survive it and support it just fine. That brings me to one final point, and I want to stress this. These cages, they protect your apple trees and your nut trees from deer. They do not protect the bark from rabbits. They will not protect the bark from woodchucks. They will not protect the bark from mice. Wrappers are still needed in the winter, even when you have these cages on there. I usually put them on in the fall and take them off in the spring. I seat them as far down against the trunk as I can and down against the soil, wrap it up tight, and that protects that fresh, tender bark from rabbits and other varmints over the course of the winter. They would love nothing more than to get in there and chew up that bark in the winter when there's no other food on the ground. I take them off in the spring because once it greens up around here, the rabbits and all that, they got plenty of other stuff to eat better than bark. So they're not going to be eating those trees during the summer. I take that right off. But it is very easy for a rabbit or any other little varmint to get in through this 2-inch by 4-inch cage. It's also very easy for a woodchuck to get under this cage if it wants to. If it wants to get in there, it will. Be mindful of that. This is in addition to wrappers, not instead of it. But with a giant cage like this, with an opening where I can unhook the zip ties real quick, get inside, put on new zip ties when I'm done, it makes it very easy to get in there and change those wrappers. Keep in mind also, those wrappers do not expand with the tree. Yes, it's true that those wrappers adjust with the tree when the tree is blowing in the wind, but as that tree grows over the course of the summer, it will grow into those wrappers. That wrapper will actually grow into the tree if you don't take it off. For that reason, I don't leave those wrappers on over the summer. They tend to hold moisture against the trunk. That might rot out the bark. A lot of bugs and pests tend to build nests behind those wrappers. If you take them off, you'll see that. So I take those wrappers off all summer long, allow the tree to grow, and then in the fall, I protect it with those wrappers. Well, I hope you found that interesting. Let me know in the comments if you have other tips or other ideas about protecting your fruit trees or your nut trees from deer. What do you do? Do you use a different type of fencing, or does something like this work for you? I'm anxious to hear because I'm always learning about this stuff and I really find it very interesting. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done so already. Check out our Facebook page as well for regular updates on the apple trees and other things that go on around here in the kingdom of Bunjie. And until next time, all hail Bunjie! The second state is #1 in my book. Baskets and keep working on the cages, the wire cages that I have around these trees, keep adjusting them and doing all this additional work. I don't like doing that, and I was trying to find this year